In this game, we're going to go for 1 e4, which is what we're going to be playing in the first few episodes of this series. My opponent responds in similar fashion, and now we're going to develop the knight to f3, which attacks the pawn on e5. There are several ways to defend the pawn, but my opponent goes for d6, which is known as the Philidor's defense. It was popularized by Francais-André de Philidor as far back as 1849. This is the most principled response, as I am pushing the pawn forward, attacking the pawn on e5 once again. If it were white to move, I'm simply going to take on e5 and black would be down a pawn. Now my opponent decides to pin the knight on f3. So far play has been standard, but now I'm going to try to set a little trap and see if my opponent actually knows what they're doing in this position. There we go, my opponent has made a pointless move. The bishop on g4 is not under any attack and doesn't need any extra protection. The queen move does nothing to improve black's position. Black is not developing a piece or trying to castle, and this is basically just a pointless queen move. Why is this important? Well, it further advances the trap which I talked about literally just a move ago, and we would see if black is going to fall for it. We start by capturing the pawn on e5. And now my opponent is completely oblivious to the trap that I have set in this position, and I do expect that of him. If you haven't fallen for this trap or you're not aware of this trap, it's very easy to miss. So, as I'm going to be doing in many other videos in this series, I'm going to be introducing new ideas to you guys. And now I capture with a fork on e5, and the bishop on g4 is hanging because my knight and queen attacked the bishop. So basically we've won 2 pawns in this position, the pawn on e5 and the pawn on f7. And now I can choose to capture with the queen and exchange queens, or capture with the knight and keep queens on the board so I can round things up quickly. As we can see, the black king is stuck in the center, so if we want to finish the game quickly, we have to go for an attack, as the king is basically immobilized in this position. Now the black queen attacks our pawn on e4, and most beginners in this position tend to play moves like knight c3 defending the pawn, but if we look closely we can see that the pawn is actually defended tactically, and we don't have to waste time defending the pawn, as we can simply castle. Black taking the pawn on e4 loses immediately to a pin on e1 by the rook. And my opponent sees this and decides to develop the knight instead. This is a very instructive moment, as we've already established that the black king is very unsafe and not going anywhere. Beginners in this position tend to start trying to checkmate the opponent immediately without even trying to develop their pieces. Before we can carry out any attack on the black king, we have to develop our pieces, as our knight and queen cannot do anything by themselves against the black king, especially considering the fact that there are several pieces surrounding the black king at the moment. So the first step in attacking is to develop your pieces. This is a point I'm going to repeat several times in this series, as you have to see it over and over again for it to stick in your mind. Now my opponent places the rook directly against my queen. This is what we call an X-ray. Black is threatening to move the knight somewhere and open a discovery against our queen. In many positions this could be very dangerous, and it's advisable not to underestimate the potential of the X-ray, but in this position I've calculated and seen that there really isn't any discovered attack that black could unleash that is going to be really dangerous, so I don't really have to move my queen away immediately. Now continuing on the theme of development, the first move that came to my mind was knight d5 going for the c7 pawn, but this doesn't work as black can simply play bishop to d6 and block the attack on the c7 pawn. Plus, it's advisable not to move the same piece twice in the opening. I know the position is completely winning for white, and even though I play knight d5, it's still going to be winning and all that, but just to emphasize the importance of simple chess principles, here we're going to start out with bishop to f4. If black plays bishop d6, we happily trade and the queen moves away. Now the rook is coming to the d file. We have 2 extra pawns. Black's king is still stuck in the center. We basically have a wonderful game. Develop your pieces and good things will happen. Now my opponent unleashes a discovered attack against my queen, and as I mentioned earlier, this is not really dangerous. Now we have 2 options. I could either go to queen f3 or queen to e2. Here I slightly prefer queen f3 because in any case the knight has to retreat. The knight coming back to e3 might intercept the queen's protection of the e4 pawn, but it's not really a problem in this position as we're just completely winning anyway. So queen e2 or f3, both are of equal strength, but I just slightly prefer queen to f3 as it seems a little more active. Now my opponent decides to play c6, covering the d5 square and taking it away from my knight, but in this position black has a lot more important things to worry about as the king is still in the center, so I would slightly prefer if black had developed a piece to see if they could kind of escape with the king, because this move again just doesn't really do anything. And now, focusing on the theme of developing your own pieces, I'm going to develop my own rook to e1, setting up my own x-ray against the black queen. And even though the e-file is not open at the moment, it could lead to some tactical difficulties for black later on in the future. Again, develop your pieces and good things will happen. I'm going to repeat this several times throughout this series. We don't have an immediate knockout, we don't have an immediate attack against the black king, so the best thing we can do at the very moment is to develop our pieces. Again, this is the problem with beginners. My opponent is completely missing the plot in this position, making pointless moves like c6 and h5, just pushing pawns. What my opponent should be trying to do is at least develop their pieces, the knight and the bishop especially, and try to get the king to safety, because these moves do not do anything. And I know I briefly mentioned the knight retreating before, but in this position the knight doesn't have to retreat as our bishop covers the e5 square, so my knight can advance to the e5 square as opposed to retreating to e3 instead. Alright, my opponent finally decides to develop a piece. And now the next move I have in mind does not require any calculation at all. It all requires just basic knowledge. As we can see, the black king is stuck in the center. I've mentioned this 100 times now. I have developed enough pieces, and now I want to go for something that has the highest shock value. It might not be the best move objectively, but I'm 100% certain it's not a blunder in any way, shape, or form. And the move I have in mind is knight to d5, sacrificing the knight on the d5 square to try to open the e-file for our rook. Remember that x-ray I mentioned a couple moves ago? Well, let's see if it's going to be useful now. Alright, my opponent decides to capture the knight, and let's see if they're aware of the traps I have set in this position. Well, not really, but I don't really think there's much black can do anyway. Now all I have to do is move my knight and the pin stands. As you can see, the queen is unable to move anywhere because my rook now pins the queen to the black king. Mission accomplished. And as you can see, this pin didn't come out of thin air. I have talked about this for several moves. I have tried to set this up. I have worked towards it by developing my pieces, castling, doing all the these are just simple principles. I have not even once calculated any 40 move sequence. I don't need to do all that, just simple principles, as you can see, has brought me this far in the game. Alright, here we just say thank you for the queen and capture with the knight as opposed to capture with the rook, but either one is fine anyway. And now the position is completely winning for white. It has been completely winning for several moves now, but just to emphasize the importance of development once again, let's bring our final piece into the game. Now look around the board and try to think about what piece is not participating in this attack and try to bring them into the game. That's right, it's the rook on a1. We were threatening to win the knight on d5, so instead black decides to trade it for our bishop on f4. We're not scared of trades, as trades only help us in this position since we're already up material, and black with every single trade loses the opportunity to create complications in the position. This position is completely hopeless anyway, so that's just it. Again, my opponent whips out another pointless knight move. My opponent is just completely missing the plot, missing the priorities in this position. Here, immediately, I can win with the move queen to b8 check, but instead I'm just going to show you that there are several ways to win in the position, and I'll play a move like rook to e1 just to pin the bishop, for example, and black is just completely tied down. And now my opponent plays this move, I guess, to sort of kick the queen away, but this is one tactic I missed over and over again when I was also in the beginner stages of my chess development. The bishop is pinned, the pawn on g5 is just hanging, and I can capture it. I guess the idea was to be able to play rook to h7 defending the bishop if I ever attack it, but in this position, rook h7 is not possible as there is a fork on g6. Now my opponent finally decides to unpin, but it's too late as I can simply win the bishop. Now there's a saying that the knight is the king's greatest defender, and it applies in this position, as in this position we don't even have a single check against the black king because the knight is controlling some key squares. If we want to make progress in this position, we have to find a way to kick the knight away before continuing with our attack, and b4 seems like the right move. Now another key point I'm going to repeat several times in this series is loose pieces drop off. If we look at the rook on h8, the rook is currently unprotected and the king is very far away from the rook, and in this position there's a 2-move sequence that wins the rook for us. If you'd like to find the move, you can pause the video and try to figure it out, otherwise keep watching. The first move is of course giving a check to the king, and no matter where the king goes, there would be a fork on the king and rook. And my opponent finally decides to resign. If the king had gone to c8 or any other square, it was going to be the same thing, as there was always a fork on the king and rook in this position. I do appreciate my opponent for playing this game out to this point, because this game has been lost for a very long time, but we get to see the instructional values of this game.